tax collectors and the prostitutes. Loan sharks and drug dealers, homeless and illegal immigrants are going into the kingdom ahead of you. Maybe that wasn't all good. Some modern additions, right? What was Jesus up to? That's been a question that's kind of hung over the church throughout its history. In fact, that probably was a question that was present in the early church, given the diversity of interpretations we find within the New Testament. It certainly was a question that was being asked during his lifetime. What is it that you're doing, Jesus? That's somewhat implied in the question of by what authority are you doing these things? And what are these things? Well, he's preaching, he's teaching, he's healing. But what's the point, Jesus? Where are you going with this? One of the things that obviously puzzled people during his lifetime was that Jesus had almost nothing good to say about the religious authorities of his day. And indeed, it doesn't look like Jesus had very much interest in religion, period. Which has always been a bit of a challenge for the church, since the church is in the religion business. We know, of course, that Jesus and the Pharisees clashed. The Pharisees were those people who were basically enforcing the Torah, which was kind of the rules and regulations in a lot of detail about how one was supposed to live a godly life on a day-to-day basis. Okay? So that was the whole thing about what kind of foods you could eat, and washing your hands, and not working on the Sabbath, and all of that, which Jesus didn't really seem to show much interest in. So the Pharisees were all tizzy about that. But Jesus also didn't show much interest in the temple, and the rituals, and all of the trappings of organized religion of his day. That's what the scribes and the priests and the leaders, the elders of the people were about. And Jesus didn't care much about them either. Well, what did he care about? Well, he gives a clue in Luke's gospel, and he does it in a few other places as well. Remember that scene where right at the beginning of his ministry, he goes to his hometown of Nazareth and stands up to preach. And he reads from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Doesn't say much about following rules and regulations, doesn't say much about making sure you offer the right sacrifice. But there's an awful lot about reaching out to people in need and bringing them good news, bringing them the gospel. Our good friend Pastor Lee last week during our adult ed session asked, I think, a very important question about the history of the church. He asked, as we were talking about the Reformation and about the transformation that brought about Luther's vision for what the church and the Christian life ought to be, Sebastian Lee asked, well, then how do you explain the church's anemic response in Germany to the rise of the Nazis, the birthplace of the Reformation? How indeed? How indeed? What went wrong? How did this happen? And for me, this has been a question hanging over the church around the world. Germany and the Nazis are a horrible example, but in many ways, the scene has been repeated all over the place, where the church has found itself on the wrong side of some essential questions about human relationships and human justice. That, in fact, is what Jesus is saying to these scribes and priests. You're on the wrong side here. In doing that, he's not saying anything particularly new, because again, we find this in the scriptures. We find this in the prophets, for example. Amos. Here he's addressing exactly these questions the scribes and the priests want. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-beings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Oh, those are tough words. What happened? What's gone wrong? Well, for Jesus, it would say we're continually looking in the wrong direction. Now, Luther, in his day, understood that the church had definitely headed in the wrong direction. The worst came when he realized people were supposedly buying their salvation, right? You buy this little certificate of paper, got the seal of approval from the Vatican, and you get people out of purgatory. They didn't really think too much about going to hell, and everybody was a Christian, but they all fell short, sometimes pretty drastically, and so they went to this holding pen called purgatory, and they could be there for a few thousand years, but eventually they would get out. Well, these certificates got people out a lot ahead of time. Pretty reasonable transaction, right? Pay your money, get your Uncle Fred out, and boy, he's really happy, and he's on his way to heaven. Okay. And of course, during that time, all that money is going to help build the St. Peter's Basilica. Literally what it was going to pay for. And Luther came along and said, no. This is not what it is. Luther had a personally transforming experience of discovering the free grace of God. How wonderful. But then somehow, we'll be talking about this, this session today and next week, something went awry. And suddenly all the focus began on getting your theological T's crossed and I's dotted. And all these inner religious arguments started about who exactly had the right teachings. Oh, and then it went really wrong, and when about 100 years later, it became a political battle. And it suddenly became the armies of the Vatican versus the armies of the Protestant princes and monarchs. And something called the 30 Years' War broke out. It's estimated that a quarter of all the German-speaking people in Europe lost their lives in that conflagration. It was horrendous. This is what the church is about. It's not a surprise then that after that people turned inward. They lost interest in the theology and in the church's superstructures and its buildings and its authorities and said, no, I just need to pray. I just need to read my Bible. Something called pietism began. And before you know it, we were right back to the situation that Jesus was facing, which was that organized religion was either interested in buildings and organizations and structures and committee meetings and all of that, or they were interested in making sure they were following the right rules every day. Praying and reading their Bible and not being immoral. Following all those right rules. And wait a second, how did we all of a sudden end up right back where we started? That, I'm afraid, is to some extent the answer to Pastor Lee's question. Because that is what the church has always kept coming back to. Let's build new buildings. Let's ordain more people. Let's have bigger choirs. Let's have more committees. Or, no, we just need to pray. We just need to read our Bibles. We need to be good people. What's going on? What's going on? Again, going back to the Bible, simple answer from one of the prophets. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God? For Jesus, it was all about how are you dealing with your neighbor? The man comes to Jesus and says, what's the great commandment? He answers his own question. Love Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you are not far from the kingdom of God. Today, as I've talked about before, we're aware that the church has kind of hit the skids. And the phenomenon we're seeing is of people saying, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And the church does not like hearing that. I've heard some pretty nasty things said and written about such people, not just by conservatives, but even by more liberal mainline church people. That's really the people that's very easy to dump on. Oh, they don't want commitments, they don't want to have to make offerings, they don't want help the organization, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm not sure where Jesus would be on that question. I don't think Jesus, frankly, was all that religious. He was obviously intensely spiritual. The church is finally forcing itself to ask some questions about what it's about. Frankly, we're realizing we can't support all of this. We can't pay for all the people like me. We can't support all the buildings. We can't keep all of this stuff going. We can't keep all these balls in the air. We just don't have the money. We don't have the bodies. So we're starting to ask ourselves, well, what is the church about then? If it isn't about those things, oh my God, what a question to ask. Kind of sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? Jesus didn't have a whole lot of interest in that. And Jesus wasn't interested in people who could memorize the Bible and say lots of prayers either. But he was very interested in saving souls. In a very different way, perhaps, than we might have heard it in some tent revival or his altar call. He was interested in people becoming wholly the people that God created them to be. So that Ezekiel says, when he's talking to the corruption in Israel, what do they need? They need to find a new heart. They need to find new life. People need to be reconciled with their neighbor. We need to find how we can live together in peace. I saw a great video. There's a lot of conversation, of course, about the tensions, the animosity, the divisions in our society, the hatred. This young man had been a skinhead as a teenager, and a very adamant one, and one who went around and spoke. He appeared on some national talk shows. He organized a band, which basically performed hatred songs. And then they made recordings. But all the time there was something inside of him that was gnawing at him that said, there's something not right here. And I think that's always true, but the question is whether that question gets really dealt with. And the thing that first got his attention was he had a baby. He obviously had lived a very difficult life. He said he found in these groups support and care and concern that he didn't find anywhere else. But now suddenly within his family he had something different. He had a child, he had a baby. That was the start. But then something else intervened. It was kind of funny. He decided that he needed, he wanted to sell his records for his hate group band, and so he opened a music store. But being a businessman, he realized, I'm not going to make a whole lot of money just selling my records, so I need to start selling other people's records, and so he became a more general record store. And then now he was dealing with people of all different kinds. And suddenly, out of sheer desire for profit, he had to talk to people that he might not have talked to before. In fact, he may have hated them. Jews, people of color, all those people that he had denounced, suddenly they were his customers. They were his market. And over time, he found himself being transformed into a new person. At the end of this little video, he says, people who hate, for them to come out of that, and indeed he formed a support group for people who come out of that hatred, they need to find something to love. Right out of the words of Jesus. They need to find a neighbor. They need to find the neighbors that God has placed in their life. Find your neighbor, Jesus says. Love them. Care about them. That's what we're here for. That will bring salvation. That the church says it needs. That all religion says it needs. That our heart says we need. Love your neighbor. That's what